The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 8th chapter. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." The Gospel of the Lord. Once again, the stories in the Gospels include details for a reason, and the detail to notice in this story is the setting, Caesarea Philippi. To grasp the meaning of this detail, we need a short history of the location. Caesarea Philippi is located near the base of Mount Hermon, which was the northern boundary of the Israelites after their conquest of the land. For the Greeks, the location was associated with the Greek god named Pan, a faun-like being known as the god of flocks and mountains, fertility, and spring. It was believed that Pan's shout caused stampedes among flocks of animals, which is how we get the word panic. Eventually, the area becomes annexed into Herod the Great's kingdom, and a temple in honor of Caesar Augustus is built. It becomes known as Caesarea Paneas. Herod's son, Philip II, later takes over and decides to rename it after himself, which is how it becomes known as Caesarea Philippi. And by the time the Gospel of Mark is being circulated, the location has changed names again. This time it's known as Neronius, after the Roman Emperor Nero. The key to all of this is the question of identity, specifically as it relates to the place of Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi was a location with an identity crisis. Pan, Caesar, Philip, Nero. It was continually being claimed and renamed and rebranded over and over by whoever was next in line to take over. The very setting of this story about Jesus was continually being redefined by what people said it was. The same is true for Jesus. Jesus knows the ever-changing identity of this place and wonders who the public says he is. This setting in Caesarea Philippi brings up a question for Jesus. He is next in line of the great prophets of God's people. There have been many to come before. So Jesus ponders the question, who do people say that I am? What identity do I carry for you? Names come and go. Which name will I be remembered by? Are there going to be others that come after me and change my name as well, rebranding my identity to become something I never intended? Will my legacy become like this place? A constantly changing identity based on whoever is in control. Peter gives two answers to Jesus' existential dilemma. The public thinks you're one of the greats, a prophet sent from God. But the disciples, the inner group of closest followers, we think you're something bigger than that. The Messiah, or the Christ, the Anointed One. We believe you are the one that will make things right, to restore balance and bring prosperity. For some, the coming of the Messiah also meant military power and overthrowing the current Roman occupiers, who were just one of many in a long line of foreign colonizers. The Messiah was to be the one to bring sovereignty to the colonized people. And Jesus, knowing they are thinking this way, knowing they are assuming that he is the one to restore balance and take power back from the oppressors, gives them a glimpse of his future. He tells them about what will really happen to him. The Son of Man will experience suffering, rejection, and death. Now, the title Son of Man is another coded phrase close to the idea of Messiah. It comes from Daniel, an apocalyptic book written late in the period of the Hebrew Bible. The Son of Man was the title of the one who was to come in glory, riding on a cloud, carrying out God's divine judgment. But Jesus does something subversive with that title. Instead of describing the Son of Man as the one to come in glory, instead he will come to suffer, to be killed, and rise again. It's not the script that they expected, mainly because of the suffering part. Few people are open to hearing that suffering is not only part of life, but it's part of the plan. Many assume that suffering is God's judgment or punishment. But God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength, according to 1 Corinthians. Peter can't believe what he's hearing. If you really are the Messiah, Jesus, why would you throw away this shot? Why would you miss this opportunity to end the occupation? Why would you choose failure? And for testing Jesus' loyalty to God, Peter is rebuked and called Satan, which, by the way, is the original meaning of Satan, the heavenly prosecutor who tests Job's fidelity to God. Peter's resistance is to the idea that Jesus will suffer. Because Peter believes and confesses that Jesus is the holy and anointed one from God, in Peter's mind, this means he will be excused from suffering. He will be above suffering because of who God has chosen Jesus to be. This is the difference between a theology of the cross and a theology of glory, as articulated by Luther. In this paradox, everything that we think is good is actually sin. And the things we think are evil are actually God's true work, which is exactly what happens at the cross. A theology of glory tries to save Jesus from the cross, explaining that there is another way to achieve greatness. A theology of the cross sees the suffering, the rejection, and the death, which are all signs of failure and loss, as the true sign of God's favor. Don't spend your life avoiding suffering. You can accumulate the whole world, insulating yourself from inconvenience, stockpiling your abundance so that you and your children and your children's children will have a better life. But you cannot escape suffering. It will find you because you are ultimately human. Look to the cross and find Jesus suffering. But this suffering is not abandonment by God. It is God's choice to radically identify with those suffering under oppression. Jesus experienced pain in order to identify with you when you suffer. God is not above suffering. In fact, God is in the suffering, which is why we take up our cross. Amen.